Hey, anatomy students, we are working our way through the skeletal system. Today is going to be video lesson 3. We're going to talk about bone formation known as ossification, and we're going to discuss fractures. So get ready for that. All right, let's go ahead and get this lesson started. All right, everybody, welcome to the next video lesson here on the skeletal system. Today we're going to talk about bone formation. That process is called ossification or osteogenesis, and it is the process of forming new bone. Bone formation occurs in 4 situations. Number 1, formation of bone in the embryo, as the cartilaginous skeleton of the embryo is converted to bone. That would be one example. Growth of bones until adulthood. So as an adolescent, as a child grows up into through puberty, the bones get longer and will get thicker. So that is another example of ossification. The remodeling of bone as you age, if you increase muscle mass, your bones will become more dense in response to the stress that the muscles put on the bones, especially if you exercise, lift weights, work out, all that good stuff. And then if there is a fracture in the bone, then that bone needs to heal. And that is the other example, the 4th example, where ossification will occur. Ossification contributing to bone length is usually complete by age 18 to 21 years of age. Now, this is an average. Females will stop growing. They mature a little faster, a little sooner than males. A lot of females will, by the time they are 16 years old, they will have stopped growing or sooner. There are some males that will grow. Most are usually done by 17 or 18 years old, but there are some males that even into their early 20s, they will continue to grow. Bones can still continue to thicken and are capable of repair even after the epiphyseal growth plates have closed. So here's this picture again, showing a child's bone where the growth plates are open. And so if you look at this x-ray, you see this gap right here. It appears that the very distal end of the bone is separate from the bone itself. Again, as I said in the previous lesson, that is because the growth plate is made of hyaline cartilage, and cartilage does not show up on x-ray. So it appears that the end of the bone is not attached, when in reality it is attached. It's just that, as I said earlier, the growth plate of cartilage does not show up on the x-ray. And we see the same thing down here. Here is the tibia, and you can see it appears that this piece of the tibia is just floating up on top. It's not. It is because of that growth plate. A balance must exist between the actions of osteoclasts and osteoblasts. Remember that osteoclasts eat away old bone matrix, and new bone matrix is laid down by the osteoblasts. If too much new tissue is formed, the bones become abnormally thick and heavy. This is a condition called acromegaly. Excessive loss of calcium weakens the bones, as occurs in osteoporosis. And if you watch any TV, you see lots of ads for the elderly and their problems with the loss of bone mass or osteoporosis. They may also become too soft, as seen in the bone disease rickets and osteomalacia. The naming of fractures can be confusing because of the many different criteria that are used. So some breaks, fractures, are named for the direction that they take. They're named for the style of break, the way the bone breaks, if the skin is broken, if there's an angle, there's all kinds of parameters. So we'll go over a few of those here shortly. Some schemes describe the anatomical appearance of the fracture. So, for example, a partial fracture. That is one where the break of any kind, the break just simply does not go all the way through the bone and does not break the bone into two complete pieces. A complete fracture is just the opposite. That is any break where the bone is in two or more pieces. A closed means it's also called a simple. That is where the bone does not protrude through the skin. An opened or compound is where the broken end of the bone punctures the skin. A green stick is another kind of fracture. This is seen in children. That is where one side of the bone breaks. It's a partial fracture because the other side of the bone does not break. Very similar to when you try to break a green twig off of a tree. If you've ever tried to do that, you have to bend it back and forth about 56 times to get that twig to finally break off. Whereas a dead one will just simply snap in two. The green stick, because children's bones are a little more flexible, they're more pliable, they have a tendency to bend, and so they bend on the inside, and then the outside will break or splinter. An impacted, that's where a bone fragment is firmly driven into the other bones. The comminuted, the spiral, transverse, and displaced are all different varieties of breaks. Those are pretty self-explanatory. So let's talk a little bit about some of the fractures. So here's an x-ray. Clearly you can see the break is right here. And as you can see, it kind of goes around the bone. That is a spiral fracture. That bone, the break goes in a spiral direction around the bone. Usually this is where the body part is twisted and the joint doesn't give way, but the bone breaks before the joint, the soft tissue in the joint gives way. And that's where the bone is twisted apart. Okay, notice here, this is looking at it. This is the humerus. So this is the head of the humerus. So here's the process off the scapula or shoulder blade. Here's the clavicle. This is the head of the humerus right here and right here. Here's the clavicle again. And so you can see the break on this side. But if you look over on this side, the break stops right here. And this angle is greatly reduced. So this shows that the bone has been bent. And it's actually changed its shape a little bit. And the break starts here and stops right there. So this is a green stick. And again, we mentioned that this is commonly seen in children. And how do we know this is a child? Because the head of the humerus appears to be separated from the metaphysis or body of the bone. And that means the growth plate's still open. So this individual, you can see it open right there. This child is still growing. So this is a classic example of a green stick. This is a complete fracture, and it was said to be this would be the distal end of the radius. And if you look very closely, you'll see that that person's name is Evan Grippa. This is my son's x-ray. And this was after a snowboarding incident when he was in middle school. So a couple things we noticed. This is what will be called a transverse, meaning that the break is directly 90 degrees to the long axis of the bone. So it makes a transverse plane. It is complete. It is definitely broken in two places. And the other thing we notice is we can tell, we look real close right there and right there. His growth plates were open. So at that point in his middle school year, I believe that was his 8th grade year, he was still growing. So that's another example of a fracture. Again, a complete and transverse fracture. This fracture is a former student. Don't know if any of you remember Joey Flo Carey. This was after a football incident on the field where he fractured his collarbone. Again, complete and straight across, so as a transverse break. Notice no open area here. He was finished growing at this point in his life, still in high school. So that's a pretty average age, around 17 or 18. I believe this was his junior year when he did this, and he was done growing longer, taller. He got thicker, he got bigger, but as far as his height goes, he was pretty well finished. And that's an x-ray of his broken collarbone. Here is a former student who was still is a dirt bike rider. And she fell off her dirt bike. And this is a definite complete break. And this is, I'll throw a couple more terms at you here. By the way, this is Miss Wiesenhahn, if those of you who remember her from just a couple years ago here at West Claremont High School, at the time of this recording, a couple years ago. Number one, it's transverse break. Number two, it is a complete break. And because the ends of the bones are not lined up anymore, clearly that needs to be realigned. And we'll talk about the term that means realigned. But that is what is called also displaced. So you can throw a lot of terms in here. That is a transverse displaced fracture. And as you can see, they had to perform surgery. They had to put in a plate and a number of screws here to hold the bone back together. And because they had to perform surgery and open her body and to realign the ends of the bones, this is called an open reduction. So when they realign the bones, that is called a reduction. There are two kinds of reductions. There's a closed reduction, which means we can realign the ends of the bone, and or in common terms, you hear them say set the bone, but it's referred to as a reduction. The two methods, the closed reduction is doing it without surgery, without opening the body. And the other method that requires surgery or opening of the body is called an open reduction. So this is a displaced fracture that needed an open reduction to realign. Now, if there is a break and the bone fragments are still in line, then that is said to be non-displaced. And here is a picture of a basketball player, Mr. Ware, I believe was his name. And during the NCAA tournament, he jumped up in the air to try to deflect a pass. And when he landed, his leg broke. And this, is a complete fracture because, that bone is definitely in two pieces. B, it's no longer aligned, so this would be a displaced fracture. And C, it's poking out of his body, so this would be referred to as a open or compound fracture. And if you saw this live, it was pretty brutal. If you watch it, I'm sure it's in 47 different places on the internet, YouTube alone. The most amazing part when he landed and fell, his entire team got up and ran away off the bench, just to give you an idea of how how tragic it was to have seen this occur right in front of you. So, some different fractures, anatomical appearance, like breaking a green twig. This is going to be the green stick. Notice it's broken over here, but not on this side, and it's bent. The angle is bent. And again, look, the growth plate's open, growth plate's open. This is a child. So it's commonly seen in children. The impacted fracture is where the bone fragments are driven into each other. So here's another, this person is still growing. We see the growth plates open, and this bone, the fragment here is driven up into this piece of the bone. So that's said to be impacted. It can also be this way, that the bone fragment is driven into the bone from the side as well. An open or compound is where the bone protrudes through the skin. We just saw one with the basketball player from Louisville. This is obviously a very serious break, and many times it is displaced because the anatomical alignment is not preserved, as they say in the definition. So some more things that go into naming fractures. Other fractures are classified by the disease or mechanism which produced the fracture. There can be a pathological fracture, usually from a cancerous process or severe chronic disease. A compression fracture is produced by extreme forces such as trauma. So when something squeezes the body part and it was squeezed so hard that the bone inside broke, that would be a compression fracture. And then a series of very small cracks or fissures due to repeated stress is simply known as a stress fracture. Still, other fractures are described by a common pattern of injury. So, and then they are usually named for the physician who did their research on that break. And it is usually a break that occurs in a very common manner and a common place, often involving more than one bone and usually denoted by an eponym or someone's name. So, for example, a Cole's fracture is a fracture of the distal end of the radius. So we go back to think about my son and his break. I'm sure that in that emergency room, I don't remember because it was a long time ago, but I'm sure that somewhere on his graph or chart that someone wrote down he had a Cole's fracture, which is easier than writing a transverse non-displaced fracture of the distal end of the radius. If you just call it a Cole's fracture and you know that a Cole's fracture is a break at the distal end of the radius, then it's a lot simpler to deal with. Same thing with POTS. The POTS fracture is the distal end of the fibula, which is the skinny bone in your lower leg. And if it's the distal end, that's down at your ankle. So you've got a wrist break and an ankle break that are named after people who did their research on that particular fracture. All right, that is going to be it for lesson 3. All right, that is all for lesson 3. Nice work. Hopefully you took very good notes and you are ready to move on to the 4th and final video in this series. So as always, thanks for watching. Email me if you have any questions, and we'll see you next time.